Ordinarily, I'm sure you wouldn't want to, but we need to cover the fact that you can move a pivot table. Having created the pivot table, and we have here a working file, sales data 2016 pivots, that has two pivot tables. One in an originally named sheet called Pivot 1, and one in an originally named sheet called Pivot 2. Both of these pivot tables are based on the data in the sales data sheet. Now, having got these pivots, we might decide we want to move them. Perhaps we'd like them in the same sheet, so that we don't have to flip between the two and we can compare what's happening. Well, to move a pivot table, you simply click into the pivot table that we would wish to move, go up to the context-sensitive ribbons up here, Pivot Table Tools, and then the Analyze one, because there are two, the Design and Analyze, and we have an option for Move Pivot Table. Selecting that option gives us the ability to move the pivot table either into a new worksheet, in which case a new worksheet would be created and that pivot table would be placed in it, or move it to an existing worksheet, and we can choose the existing worksheet by using the Browse option here. I can move it to Pivot 1, and then I need to select a cell, that cell being the starting point for the pivot table. If I place it here, go back with the Browse and then OK, that pivot table is then moved from Pivot 2, which is now empty, into Pivot 1 and placed here. When you move a pivot table like this and place it in another sheet, what you do have to be careful of is that you're allowing the pivot table enough room to exist. For example, if I'd placed it here, it wouldn't be able to go there because there's already a pivot table there. Or if I placed it a little bit too close to here and I wanted to add another column in here, I wouldn't be able to because there'd be a pivot table in the way. So it's just a little bit of forethought of where you want it to put. But it can exist here, and widening the columns means I can then read it all. It's still connected to the data. It still updates from that data, but we've just moved its location. So you click into the pivot table you wish to move, Move Pivot Table, and you have two simple options, into a new worksheet or an existing worksheet. When it's an existing worksheet, you need to use the little Browse icon to tell it not only the worksheet, but effectively the top left-hand cell. So at the point you want the pivot table to start. So if I wanted to go back to Pivot 2, I could click there, Pivot 2, back up to A1, browse back, OK, and the pivot table moves back to Pivot 2. Deleting a pivot table is even easier, and there are two ways. If, like in this particular workbook, we've actually got separate pivot tables in separate sheets, then the easiest way to remove the pivot table is actually just to delete the sheet. I could go to Pivot 1, right click, delete, tells me am I sure I want to delete the sheet because it will now be gone. Delete, and the sheet's gone. That's option 1. Option 2, I simply click into the pivot table, come back to the pivot table toolbars, so the Analyze one again, and we have here Select and Clear. Well, it's Clear that I would want, Clear All, or Select, and I can select the entire pivot table, and then I can clear. From the Analyze ribbon, I can choose Clear or Select. If I choose Clear, there is an option for All, but this is not quite deleting, because watch what happens. It does clear all, but all it does is clear what you've actually chosen, leaving you the pivot table in place ready to go and choose other columns. So that wasn't quite the option that I wanted, so I undo to bring those back. The easiest thing here is to go Select Entire Pivot Table, and then you can press Delete on the keyboard, which will then remove the entire pivot table. We either remove the whole sheet that the pivot table is sat within, which is great if it's a pivot table in its own sheet. If it exists in a sheet with other pivot tables or even with the data, then you would need to choose Select All to select the entire pivot table from the pivot table ribbon and then Delete on the keyboard. There are two ways of deleting and the single way of moving a pivot table from being in a shared sheet to being in a sheet on its own.